The Disney era of Star Wars has been extremely hit or miss, and tonight, the latest Star Wars series, Ahsoka, drops on Disney+. Now, the trailers for the show promised a classic Star Wars feel, but at the same time, it's also a continuation of two different animated shows. Will that make it a great way to expand the Star Wars lore, or is it a bit too niche for some Star Wars fans? Let's talk about it. Let me know what you thought down below in the comments, and let's get started with the good. And I'm happy to say that I had a good time with the first two episodes of Ahsoka. The big thing that stood out to me that this really does feel like classic Star Wars as the trailers promised. Of all of our Disney Plus shows thus far, without question, this is the one that captured the vibe of the original trilogy the best. There's a galactic threat. The stakes are massive. There's Force users, masters, apprentices, all kinds of lightsaber duels happening left and right. Even kind of the way that the story is told, the pacing, the nature of certain shots is just reminiscent of elements from the original trilogy. So it just feels like classic Star Wars that I love and want more of. Like, I loved a lot of The Mandalorian, and what The Mandalorian does really well is tell different kinds of stories, but in the world of Star Wars, it's true to the universe, but it feels a bit different because he's a Mandalorian and not a Force user, so it gives it a bit of a different flavor. And this gets back to the nature of the storytelling, the flow, the vibe, and so it just feels like we're continuing the original trilogy in a lot of ways and seeing what would kind of happen next. Or another example of it, I loved Andor, but that show very intentionally feels dramatically different from classic Star Wars. It's much more of a thriller, political intrigue, character study, and here we're getting back to classic Star Wars. Also, the storytelling here is more sophisticated than the storytelling in The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian stories are intentionally episodic, simplistic tales where it's fun to go on these straightforward adventures. And here, there's just kind of more layers to everything taking place. Likewise, we're seeing the story from the perspective of both our antagonist as well as our protagonist. There's different groups of people involved on the good side as well as on the bad side. And so the story has multiple layers. Not that I'm saying that this is an incredibly complex tale or anything like that, but it just has a bit more depth of storytelling than, say, The Mandalorian does. And because it's pulling in a bunch of characters from animated shows of past, there just feels like a lot of history. Everything feels like people that have known each other a long time, that have been part of this adventure a long time. There's people we care about, so there's always more to learn, more to explore, and there's depth to all of it. Right along those same lines, it fills in a lot of gaps. Of course, if you're a Clone Wars Rebels fan, it's catching us up on where a lot of these characters are at. But also just in the Star Wars lore, there's a lot of gaps and questions between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens about how did this gigantic Empire-inspired force, the First Order, how did it rise? And of course, a lot of that's been explored in the books, but in the actual live action, in animation, there's still a lot of questions, and this is kind of more directly addressing it. In The Mandalorian, once again, of course you have Moff Gideon and all of his scheming, but because the actual perspective is so on Mando, it feels like we only get these little glimpses of what's going on with Moff Gideon and his schemes, whereas here, you're following the adventure of these Imperials and what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, and so it just feels much more present. There's a much greater prominence of what they're doing, and so it fleshes out the world of Star Wars in this really important window of time to answer some really important questions that I want answered. Along these same lines, Ray Stevenson is one of these standouts here. He recently passed away, so this might be his final role, one of his final roles, and easily he just has a screen presence And the way his character is written, you just know there's like a history with him of the way he's interacting with different characters, learning of other Force users. And while he clearly has a mission that he's on, that he's passionate about, there's more layers to him. That's that word I could kind of keep going back to, or maybe there's intrigue being set up in these first 2 episodes. There's questions being raised that I want answered as the season goes on, and it does a good job of that. So for me, I went into this really hopeful that we were going to get some classic Star Wars with a massive threat, cool villains, and heroes on a quest to save the day. And that's what this delivers. You get all of that stuff that you want from Star Wars. Regular enough action sequences, chases, lightsaber battles, Force-using villains, Force-using heroes, camaraderie. It's all in here. So for me, I got what I wanted. I had a good time with it. I didn't think it was perfect or phenomenal, so let's move on to the mixed aspects of the show. And the most important thing here is that this is Rebels Season 5 starring Ahsoka. For better, for worse, how much mileage you get out of the fact that it's Rebels Season 5 will depend on the individual. How much that hurts the show for you will depend on the individual, because this is very much so building off the finale of Rebels. All of these interactions between characters kind of assume a certain amount of knowledge about who characters are and events that took place in the show Rebels. In which case, if you're a fan of Rebels and you want a season 5, you want to see what's happening with everybody, you're going to have a blast here. You're going to probably eat this show up because it is absolutely designed for you. I'm kind of in the middle. I watched Rebels when it first premiered. I watched through it one time, and I've scattershot rewatched a few episodes, but it's been a number of years since I've watched through Rebels, so it's like, okay, yeah, that was fine. I was okay with that, but I didn't love it. And so there's a lot of details that are a little bit fuzzy for me as to what happened. So I was trying to play a little bit of catch up. The novelty of seeing most of these characters in live action once seeing them once again didn't mean too much to me. So I'm a Star Wars fan. I have watched Rebels. I'm not specifically a Rebels fan, so there wasn't much to that for me. And I suspect there's a batch of Star Wars fans that would see the trailer and go, "Ooh, cool, classic Star Wars. This is the show I've been waiting for." And then they're gonna watch it, and it's gonna feel a little bit like it's at arm's length, like they're on the outside of an in-joke. Everybody else in the room knows what's going on, knows each other, and you're the third wheel tagging along, trying to play catch up on everything. So I think there's going to be, for a show that kind of, with its vibe, the story being told, the scope, the size, the flow, feels very classic Star Wars and should be unifying because it is so Rebels and Clone Wars focused. I think it might split the audience a little bit because of that, which I'm kind of disappointed by. I wish there was a little bit more in the setup, maybe even doing a previously on Rebels at the beginning of the show to play catch up for people that didn't see some of those events or haven't, like me, haven't watched them in several years. I think that would have helped a lot to make this more accessible to more people. From there, let's move on to the bad. And the first thing that comes to mind here is that I did think it was a little bit slow. There's a lot of characters, a lot of locations, a number of action set pieces. We're on a quest, there's cool interactions, but I think everything plays out a little bit too long. And there's just a number of these shots of just someone walking through a room and sitting down, and even the pacing between interactions in the conversations, the rate at which they're responding to each other can be a little bit slow. Likewise, the show can be stiff and rigid at times, and somewhat even the direction in some of the performances is just lacking a certain, liveliness. And especially like Ahsoka, she's the lead of the show, but outside of her fighting sequences, she just doesn't have anything in the characterization that like pops much. She's got a few really good lines, but the performance, the characterization, just there's not a lot that pops to kind of hook you to her to make her particularly interesting in and of itself, in the show itself. Without prior knowledge, what you're just watching here, she's just kind of stiff and distant. Another thing in here, and this is particularly true in the second episode, it's tough to talk about this without going into spoilers, but I felt like there were some CW characterizations. And what I mean by that is I watched a large chunk of the Arrowverse, and on those shows, they very frequently have grown-ups, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, who are acting like they have the emotional maturity and wisdom of a 12-year-old. And there's some of that in the second episode. Trying to be as vague as possible to not spoil things. There's a character that does something very foolish in the first episode that has consequences. And the way that it's kind of discussed in the next episode by some characters doesn't feel like grown-ups are talking about what just took place, especially in light of the consequences, the potential stakes of what has happened. They're not talking like grown-ups processing what happened. They're talking the way teenagers think about things like this, with a certain simplicity and that's not fair, but they actually did this. Did you really? Has a little bit of that flavor to it. Another one on here, and this is a common Disney issue I've had even with some of their movies over the last few years, but it just has this overly bright Disney Channel look to it, like that, where the saturation, the coloring, it's just too bright. And in particular, in the world of Star Wars, everything's kind of too clean. One of the things Star Wars was initially famous for was this lived-in look, where things seem very old and worn down and rugged. And there are some sets here that have that vibe to it, and then there's a lot of them that look like they just bought that costume at the store, and that gives it that cosplay look, because it doesn't look lived in. It doesn't look like it has a history and a past. And a lot of this had that look to it. There's too bright, too clean, too saturated, and it just calls out the fact that you're looking at costumes and things like that. When you put it all together, I enjoyed the first 2 episodes. Can't wait to see where they're gonna go with the rest of the season. A little bit nervous because 6-episode seasons on Disney Plus don't have a great track record. Hopefully this is the exception that pulls it off, that teaches the other shows how to do this properly. But love the classic Star Wars feel, maybe a little bit too slow. Think Rebels fans will love it. Some people might find it a little bit at arm's length because they don't know the characters, but I think they did a good job with it thus far. If you enjoyed this video, I've done a ton of other Star Wars content. I've ranked all the movies and stuff like that right over there. Done a ton of coverage of the TV shows. Thank you so much for watching. Keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye-bye.